Hi, how you going up there? You good? Um, so today we're going to talk about something that I call interpretation machines, and this lecture is later than it was supposed to be because I went to Johannesburg and had a look at some sort of memorials on the weekend, and so at the end of the lecture we'll have a discussion around those memorials. But and so the lecture arises from a tendency that I noticed in landscape architecture projects, student projects in the 90s that has been increasing, I think, and that comes to this idea about the relationship of landscape design and program. Obviously, program in architecture is something which is got some level of solidity, and we've talked about this before in terms of the fact that at its most basic, the house has a series of things that it should do, and architecture is driven in relationship to program or function. Now, even when it's not driven to that, it's still deliberately not driven by that insofar as it's got a position in relationship to it. Landscape has a very different and ambiguous and changing relationship to program. And so, even we should also recognise that even the word program as functional program is a relatively recent idea that probably comes up a lot since modernism, and we talked, I think, before about the relationship of things in the 19th century around architectural orders having symbols to align with function, so that a public building that was dedicated to health would use a certain type of column, etc. So that meaning has changed to the point where the sort of idea about, which is Louis Sullivan's expression of form follows function, that sort of has conditioned our idea that a piece of design should have an aesthetic relationship to what it does and what it's for. And for landscape, this is ambiguous, and in a way, its changing sense of that reflects the preoccupations of the time. So that, for example, in a sense, if we talk about the picturesque, an English garden in the 18th century, where essentially the garden was a site for vision and for view and for aesthetic appreciation, that in a way was part of its function, part of its relationship to taste. Over time, we've seen that change where at the moment, as we discussed about infrastructure, the idea that landscape is instrumental, that it does something ecological, that it works with ecological services is now an idea about its function. If we talk about the idea of green infrastructure and the diversities of interpretation to that, part of it is the idea that landscape is socio-political, has a relationship, its aesthetic, its green performance relates to social benefit. I mean, that's something we also talked about in relationship to Olmsted. And here, as much as I'm talking about landscape practice, I'm talking about landscape as a thing, a design thing in cross practices. But this idea that the landscape is something which interprets, and the design of landscape is something that interprets, is a relatively recent thing and something that comes, I would say, since postmodernism. And don't forget that during postmodernism we had this sense that after the rejection of history of modernism in postmodernism, it hinged around meaning and the idea that things should mean something as much as things should have a certain function. And so interpretation machines is a term I've used to talk about when a project's sole role or its entire basis of what it is to interpret something else. That interpretation can have to do with sight, and I've got three typologies that I'm going to talk about. One is this idea of the landscape as an interpretation machine in a most basic sense. Another one is approaches to sight, which are range between one that I call a palette-based approach, which is where to say that the substance of the site is used in the design, and one that I call a relationship-based approach, which is one which is about catalysing site relationships. And so the reading that you guys did as part of your assessment, which was the Mosbach and Claremont reading, is really a key one because of the fact that it ties together ideas about the relationship between individual experience of landscape as a kind of revelatory experience and the description of that experience via a sort of scientific paradigm. And that tension in landscape is best dealt with in a way in the French because they're able to hold both of those ideas together, whereas a lot of the time in the English-speaking world and the German as well, there is this thing around it's either culture or nature, it's science or it's art, whereas in actual fact I think that French one is probably an interesting position because it straddles both. And so if we talk about this idea of the interpretation machine, I think it's also, inherently we're also talking about memorials. And as I said, at the end we'll talk about memorials because also memorialization is something which is now probably one of the main ways that public meaning is transmitted. And it's incredibly important insofar as it's a collective site that tries to maintain a static meaning in relationship to dynamic ideas. Now, obviously, we're at UCT, which is the world home of the Roads Must Fall movement, and we know from our experience here that the Rhodes sculpture was an incredibly contested item that demonstrated that interpretations of landscape cannot be assumed to be correct. And we know that in South Africa, there's a very big and present debate around those monuments. So that, for example, interestingly, while the Roads Must Fall movement was operating, the ANC's position on the sculpture was that it should stay, and their position on meaning is to say that South Africa has had a history, and that history must be expressed so that one is that people are aware of that history so that it can never happen again, essentially. And also the recognition that there are different values of things related to the people, and it's recognised in the Freedom Charter, and that ethnic groups have a right to their own meanings. And so in that sense, the ANC had a quite a, you might almost say, conservative position compared to the position of the Roads Must Fall movement, which was that the sculpture was a direct demonstration and, in fact, a oppressive mechanism that reminded people constantly of a colonial history. Now, that's in a way because it's got a very finite structure, insofar as if you think about those type of memorials, they have a person on a pedestal. Now, we talked earlier on about the relationship between the sculpture and the pedestal when we did the first lecture and we talked about object and field. That the sculpture sits on a plinth, and the plinth is a universalizing, decontextualizing mechanism because effectively it separates it from the site. The sculpture could be anywhere. It's the plinth that negotiates the sculpture with a specific place. The sculpture itself could be anywhere. That's exactly the same in architecture, for example, of what the podium does to a tower. It's a negotiating device to a generality, to a ground condition. Now, we also talked about how conceptual art during the postmodern period, in the late modern period, changed so that sculpture became site-specific, and we talked about Rosalind Krause's article, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And so what happened, and what my colleague Sue Ann Ware calls whose research is about memorials, what developed is something which you might call the anti-memorial, which is that instead of the memorial having a clear meaning that's directly demonstrated because of the fact that the icon is visible, its identity is clear, it communicates very clearly, instead the anti-memorial expects the user and the visitor to get involved with the interpretation, to move into the site and to bring their own reading to the thing. And so in that sense, there's some functional ambiguity in the sculpture because of the fact that you have to bring to it your own understanding. And so one of the most famous of these is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin. Now, this project is interesting also because Maya Lin was a student. It was quite a quick kind of design competition, and it became something that really set up her entire career. And so if we look at it, it's in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is absolutely chock-a-block full of monuments. And so if you wanted to, you could see every possible period of how public meanings was communicated during that time. And so obviously we also have to accept that something which your generation might not know as much about, but Vietnam was also a war that had a lot of public sentiment against it. And because of that, the veterans from Vietnam felt incredibly aggrieved that they were not recognised as soldiers in terms of their contribution and the impact that Vietnam had on them. And so, in a sense, they were the unnamed, underground, disliked veterans. And so it's not a surprise then that the memorial itself is in the ground. And so we could have just as easily talked about this in relationship to figured ground. And as we can see here, if we look at the form of it, it could remind us of another project that we talked about in Barcelona from roughly the same time. Does anyone remember that project? Where the memorial, which was also a memorial, where the ground dipped down, the Carme Fields, Fossila Moreres, which was in front of the church. And so in this sense, we're giving you the aerial view, but obviously you don't get the aerial view. What you get is that you get the fact that you have a kind of an upper surface where from one direction the whole thing disappears and you can't see it at all, whereas from another direction it is actually it is visible. And so the process, it's very much around the sort of process of movement. And so as you can see, you kind of move down the length of it to the bottom and then back up the other side. And as you move into it, there's a series of names on it. And those names, it's essentially a statistical diagram because the start of what you're looking at is the start of the war at one end and the end of the war at the other, and the way that the deaths occurred along it. So it's a diagram where this is the most intense period in the middle in terms of people who died. And so it sort of straddles it straddles both the sort of ideas really, because on the one hand it's ambiguous insofar as it's a sort of sculpture buried in the ground, very site-specific, but at the same time it has the names of the people who were killed on it, and so that, for example, you can see where people will scratch on there to sort of take the name, to get a transfer of the name of somebody who might have been their father, or whatever. And so it's a sort of, it's not ambiguous and it's ambiguous at the same time. And obviously we have similar issues around people potentially falling into it, and there's a whole range of pragmatic things about it that have had to be brought under control because it's a sort of shape. But it is the kind of classic example of an interpretation scheme. Now, if we look at the relationship of it to site, which is a key thing that I'm talking about here, and we look at how specific it is to the site, we can say on the one hand it's general because it's memorialising something that's in another place, so it's got no specific relationship to the site. But being in Washington, D.C., a place of protest, a place where decisions about wars are made, in a way it's highly specific because it's sort of located politically in that location. If we kind of move on to another one here, this is we can see in this one, this is a sort of it's a sort of an earthwork. There's another one here which is a project in Duisburg by a guy called Danny Caravan, and Danny Caravan is a sort of German Jewish artist, and he undertook this project where it's a sort of an interpretation of it's a sort of a remembrance site for the murder of Jews in Germany. And so in some sense it's an artwork, and it features a series of sort of monolithic structures where there both is and isn't a relationship between the specific site and the form of the landscape around it. And so to some extent it's made up of a series of gestures. And so, for example, it does engage and lock into some existing buildings, but its organisation on the ground and there's creation. So these type of axes and these sort of gestures, they lock into urban fabrics and they lock into particular site geometries. But after that, there really is a series of abstract sculptural elements that are telling a story, but they're not actually direct. They're more setting up a series of sort of relationships. And so in some places you have these sort of landscapes where there are existing materials that are left on site that relate to its memorial function. But at other points, as I say, there is more like experiential conditions, thresholds, sequences, and these are the kind of things we see in a lot of memorial projects. Because effectively a memorial, if we think about communication and the basic way that a memorial works or interpretation works, is that we're trying to communicate between the designer's intention and the receiver. And so this is something that in art, for example, has a huge amount of discussion, which is sort of around something that's called reception theory. In the history of landscape in the 19th century, these English picturesque gardens, most of the scholarship right now is all about reception theory, which is, so the designers did this, and when you move from this part of the garden to the next part of the garden, you get this meaning. And so they're trying to use almost scientific methods to try to say, you get here, then you think this, and because this thing is next, your next thought is this. And so in memorial, sequence is an incredibly important thing. And so that in that sense, there's also something which is a relationship between that, which is around what's known as the idea of the death of the author. And the death of the author is a kind of counterposition which says you can't ever assume, you're not interested in what the person who created the work is doing. You're not interested in what they were thinking, what they were aiming to do. The author is irrelevant. Whereas inherently in a monument project or memorial project, the author is very important because you're trying to pick up what they're trying to say. And so you and they are tied to each other. Now, whether or not that's possible is something that is really, really problematic. So I've been reading, for example, because I'm giving a lecture tomorrow on the impact of Koolhaas on urban design thinking. I've been looking a lot at where Koolhaas positioned himself and OMA positioned themselves during that period of postmodernism. And so, for example, they would not buy into any idea about collective meaning, for example. And the idea that for example, they also won't buy into the idea that there is any social agency directly to architecture, but only that there is actually building which operates within an economic system, etc., but architecture can't fix anything. And so whereas these things would all suggest that design is a communicative tool, and that's a very particular position that, for example, I don't believe in that, for example. I don't think you can. I think that the old-fashioned sculptures, for better or worse, did communicate clearly, and that's why we've got the problems we've got, is you can disagree with them. But when you start to move into interpretive mechanisms, you have to say, can you guarantee that a person will pick up what you're saying? Not really, because everyone's different. And so I find it offensive, the idea that automatically I'm going to get what you say because you're making an assumption about me then. You're making an assumption that I'm going to be the same as you, and it's like, stuff you, I'm different, I'm me, I'm specific. And so the death of the author is a really important question for me because I think that a project has to be autonomous from, not autonomous in terms of autonomous like architecture is autonomous, but autonomous as in it's not about the designer. Once it goes into the world, any Joe Blow who walked into it on the street is going to have the right to take it in whatever it means, and therefore we have to make sure it does certain things because regardless of the meaning, for example, is it safe? Is it providing certain things? Meaning for me doesn't matter. If it helps you generate the project and the project that comes out of it is great. We had this conversation last year, I remember. Then that's great. But after that, it's no longer yours, it's the world's. But and this is an interesting project to talk about that in relationship to, which is, this is a project called the Garden of Australian Dreams. Now, the landscape students, I think, did you discuss it with Clinton last year? No. But it's a very particularly Melbourne project, which is a city where I was educated. And so that's a really terribly res image, but it's in the city of Canberra, and Canberra is our national capital in Australia. And as a city, Canberra is very symbolic. It's designed after a diagram by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie, and it's really a diagram of the structure of government. So, you know, the courts are here, the social service things are here, the library is here. It's a diagram that structures the landscape. And so that's already, whether it's interpretive or not, it's a representation. All the public architecture traditionally in Canberra is either neoclassical or modernist in the sense of it's brutalist, and it's from that very state sort of brutalist language. And so to put in a proposition which is as colourful and whimsical as this into Canberra for the National Museum was a highly politically contentious thing in Australia. One is it's not speaking the same language as the public architecture, which was brutal and monumental but not really saying very much apart from the sort of state power. And instead, because the project came from a period of postmodernism, it had lots and lots of buried references in it that people didn't like or were a bit uncertain of. And so, for example, you know, the landscape was undertaken by Richard Weller in a practice called Room 413. The architecture is by Ashton, Raggett and McDougall. And, for example, if we look at this, and I can only say this because I know, and so they wouldn't say it matters at all whether or not you know this or not. You could still go to that site and kids will tear around in this area and hop into these water features and climb over these things and treat it like a playground. It doesn't matter to them. So it's got some qualities that are separate, arise because they were generated through an interpretive idea, but are separate from it. You don't need to know those ideas to kind of have fun in the camera obscura or the whatever or whatever. Now, one of the main gestures is, for example, that because Canberra is a site of axes, government, design, etc., there's one major gesture in the site, which is this curled piece here. And what that is, that's the snapped axis. And so the idea is that that arises on the site through a relationship to the centre of Australia. And so they're saying, you know, there's geometry on the site, but the real heart of Australia is desert. And so the idea is that this axis projects so far into the centre of the country that it's snapped and it's sort of left over here as this sort of loop to sort of reference the fact that Australia has a totally other side to it. You know, it's got a strong political agenda to it. And so, for example, this map here overlays Western maps with Aboriginal language maps. And so, for example, it demonstrates that the map of Australia that we think we have is different to the map of Australia that Indigenous people have. It utilises things like surveyor's marks to reference that sort of territorial aspect of mapping. And so there, for example, there is the snapped part of the snapped axis, that line going through there. You know, at the same time, it also has, it has within it things like, you know, in Australia there was a controversy where the government spent, in the 1970s, the government spent $1 million to buy a Jackson Pollock painting called Blue Poles. And people were horrified that the government would spend $1 million on a painting that was from another country. But at the same time, there was also a general thing about like, that's not art. What is that? That's just a whole lot of lines, you know? And so it was also a cultural cringe thing where it's like Australians don't know what art is. And so all through the whole landscape, there are these blue poles all the way through it. It's very, in a way, it's incredibly literal. And one other thing that they did was, one other kind of weird thing also is that they're a Christian firm, so they're continually burying these fish symbols into their buildings all the time, and people never really pick up on it until after it's built. There's always one of those somewhere in the building. And then, as you can see, what's that building? No, it's Daniel Libeskind's Berlin Museum, Jewish Museum in Berlin. And so what they did was they put that building in there and they rescaled it and they made it black and they put braille along the side of it that said, "She'll be right, mate," which is an Australian term to say, "Oh, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be all right." And so it's a kind of a thing to say Australia's attitude to Aboriginal people has been, "Oh, she'll be right. Don't worry about it." But in actual fact, what's happened in Australia was genocide, and so they put in the Jewish Museum in the site as a reference to say Australia has its own genocidal history. Now, what happened? Daniel Libeskind took them to court for plagiarism. And so what happened is that they had a kind of court case where they openly in court talked about appropriation, sampling, mixtapes, collage, until eventually it turned into a kind of intellectual discussion between Libeskind and the firm, and they dropped the case altogether and they decided it was okay. But so, you can see this is where we go from, if we look at those projects and we go from one end to the other, we can see that this is a really, in a way, is a very straightforward memorial. It's got a really clear way of telling what it is. It's a whatever. This one is an ambiguous one, and this one here is what happens when you layer things over and over and over and over and over and over and over with meaning. And so the idea would be that it's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, I don't particularly like it. I like some of the spaces, like this space here, which is the main entry. If you go in there, it's one of the most glorious spaces. But the way it was generated, for example, is that they always do this thing where they treat their buildings as a solid volume, and then they subtract a geometry out of them. And so what that is like a stitch of a knot put through the centre, subtracted, and then turned into this kind of opera house type of interior with these sort of fluted skylights, etc. So it's a sort of digital thing. So this is this thing where I call them interpretation machines, because they are directly focused on interpreting the site or being a tool of interpretation of another concept, of another thing. Now the next projects I'm going to talk about are really both site-based, and so this is where I'm not calling them interpretation machines directly, because the way that they're talking about, or the way they're interpreting, is very much based around site. And so it's a question of whether or not engagement with site is an interpretation. If the site is really there, then is it an interpretation, or is it actually just a utilising of what's at hand? Now, I wrote an article in about 10 years back where I looked at projects in Sydney Harbour, and I divided, and those projects were very site-based projects, and I divided them up and said that basically there's two approaches that I saw. One of those approaches is a pallet approach, and a pallet approach is to say that the way I reference site is through the materials that I use. The project's not representational in the sense that this is representational, but its materiality is derived from the site's materiality, and it's in a way referencing the site through its selection of materials, through its palette. And I compare that to one called a relationship approach. And so if we look at a palette approach, one of the kind of classic projects like that would be this one, which is a landscaping of the Acropolis by Dimitri Picturesque. Do you guys know this? Have you seen this project before? It's an exceptionally beautiful project. I mean, who's been to the Acropolis here? Nobody. I haven't either. It's one of the places I really want to go. But Picturesque is quite interesting because really the project wasn't really drawn. I mean, there was a drawing that was like this of the site, and then there were kind of like details like this. But in a way, those drawings were delivering or developing an approach to how to deal with material. So no one was sent out necessarily to build this exact pattern on that landscape. Instead, what Picturesque was doing was creating a kind of analogy in the drawing. So the drawing becomes a test to be able to develop a sensibility that then will get deployed with on-site solutions. And so this is an important idea as well as this relationship between representation and site. And so obviously with design, and this is something which as we get onto the second half of the semester, we're going to get less and less in the design end and more in the implementation end. because one of the things I'm arguing is that we've been moving towards a sort of a movement away from design as a practice where the drawing is given to someone else who makes, and more into design as a one-to-one real-time practice where things are made and implemented. And obviously things like pop-up, things like installation, performance, those type of things are all based on a direct one-to-one time-based involvement. And so this project's interesting because Piccionis was developing these sort of approaches through drawing, but after that, what was happening is that he was really supervising on site to accumulate and to, on the one hand, collect all of this material, because when we think about the Acropolis, we're thinking about a place that's had thousands of years worth of accumulated stonework. Like, it's been people rebuilding, knocking down, victors coming and changing, heritage regimes, bits of detritus, piles of stone. So there's so much on the site already. Piccionis really just went around the site and supervised groups of workers and then assembled that material. Now, it doesn't, there's some key things about this that you can see that it's about on-site work, and mostly because of that grade, for example. And so if you think about doing something like this, a survey is only going to give you so much information. When you've got this sort of stonework, and when you've got a level that you have to meet and a level that you have to meet, and you want this to be a smooth plane, that only happens because somebody on site is setting out and supervising the levels. No amount of drawing is going to make that happen. Only supervision will make that happen. Now, currently, obviously we have contracts that are set up around separating out the stages. Whereas, for example, a lot of the time we celebrate design as the major act, and we have professional practice regimes that separate, briefing, schematic design, or concept design, schematic design, design development, tender, contract administration, etc. And we have this idea that if we have as much money as we can have during the design phase, everything's going to go right. But in actual fact, I worked for a company where they obviously had to set their breakups of amounts the same as everybody else. But instead of doing all their work in the design phase, they did as little work in the design phase as possible to get the client to sign off by producing just plans and sections, very simple idea. And then they moved all of the money to the documents and the design development and then the implementation. Because they said so much is going to happen during the construction process and during the administration process that if that goes wrong, it doesn't matter how good the design was, because if it doesn't get onto the ground right, the design makes no difference. So let's actually keep our money for when we're really going to need it to make this thing really zing, and that's what they did. So it shows you how the relationship of site. And so, this is, on the one hand, the project's reasonably straightforward. It's about access, but it's also about the contractor. So, for example, if you think about how you would tell somebody to do this, on the one hand, you are potentially, you might have drawn a sketch like this, but really, if you've got a person on site with a whole lot of rocks, you might sort the rocks and say, we'll sort the long strips over here, and I want you to do something where all the way through I want you to have a strip and have it so it comes through like this. But ultimately, you're probably talking about the fact that you have to have a bloody good contractor who understands the way you're thinking about the project, or in themselves is a craftsperson to do it. Either you're supervising it or you're trusting somebody. And so, in landscape, I know a lot of people who've done work in national parks. And so what they'll do instead of designing anything really is they'll do a photo montage, they'll get the staff, and they'll set up a situation, and they'll work with the staff to resolve that general type of situation of putting a series of steps around a tree, and they'll say, see how we resolve that type of situation? See how we resolve this type of situation? Now we're going to drop you off with a helicopter in the middle of the bush, and you've got to make steps. But you've actually we've already talked about how that is going to happen. It's trusting the craftsperson or the contractor as artisan. Now, this is something which I think is really important, and at the moment, internationally, but particularly in South Africa, for example, I would argue that there's not enough investment in the trades here. There's a lot of underinvestment in labour that's not properly paid, and then there's people who are running businesses who are supervising unpaid, untrained people, well, not unpaid, lowly paid people, but there's not enough investment in skilled tradespeople who are properly trained and properly paid for their work, which is only, you have to have something like this. Ultimately, Australia has changed to the point where contractors earn more than designers in Australia. So, if you're the architect, you're going to go to I went to one crazy project where our carpenter contractor, and most of the work with Donovan Hill was timber, and it was like they were having a party on the Gold Coast in their house that had a sort of a skate bowl built into the backyard, and it was just the most expensive house I'd ever seen, and that was the carpenter. And so that's because that's the way that it's got now, which is that the trades are so rare, but the qualities that people expect are so high. Everyone's been sent through university expected to be a designer, or that's right, whereas the people who are actually stayed with their trades can ask whatever they want. And so it's a really interesting situation. So another project which and so I call this a pallet approach because of the fact that it's utilising and drawn from the site materials and the relationship of building. Another older project, which is a kind of great project in this sense, and I suppose it's also about taking a position on what's on site, taking a position on how to handle history, for example. And here's another project that's a good example of that. This one's the Prague Castle upgrade by Plesnik. Plesnik's one of those guys he was sort of like a postmodernist before there were postmodernists, and he was stuck in time. And so sometimes, we hear about designers who are of the time leading the agenda, your Mies van der Rohe's, your Korbs, etc., Frank Lloyd Wright's. You hear about those designers, but sometimes there's designers who are out of time. They're doing something that's against what the current trend is. And often they're the ones that we actually celebrate the most, and people who are like that are Carlo Scarpa would be like that. This guy Plesnik would be like that. Lina Bobardi, who's somebody who people talk about a lot in Brazil, is like that. And Plesnik's like that because if you think about him working in the 20s to 30s, he was working in a sort of Art Deco meets neoclassicist mould, when in actual fact that modernism was the heights of architectural innovation. And a lot of what he was doing is work that's the reason why I think it's important for landscape is that working with old cities is ultimately about regularization, which is to say we are, when we've got an old city, it's really focused on, it's grown somewhat organically. It's grown by one thing reacting to another thing, reacting to another thing. But when we then bring a contemporary agenda to it, a lot of the time we're having to regularize things because there's been a difference between what was the norm when it was built and what's the norm now. Classics would be, disabled access would be probably the single most classic thing that's done that. Safety would be another thing. All of the vehicular access to old cities. And so what you're looking at is a kind of overlay of contemporary standards on old spaces. And so that's what Plesnik was working on. And also places which have evolved over time have a lot of detritus where stuff has accumulated just through the fact that it's organic. Something's happened and something's happened and something's happened and something's happened. And so there's a lot of stuff. And so a lot of these projects tended to be about stripping back. And here Plesnik was doing interesting things where on the one hand, he was simplifying this surface. And so we talked in this sort of first class about this sort of Beth Myers. In fact, there was an article that was supposed to be up for this week, I think, but I'll put up. Beth Meyer has an article called Site Citations, but in the article that she did on landscape as modern other and postmodern ground, she talks about this type of modern landscape that she calls the minimal garden. And she calls it that because what it's really about is about surface. And in this situation, you can see that the whole of this, by keeping it totally open, the emphasis becomes on the volumetric space because the landscape stretches right out to the edge of the building. And then the surface is figured. It's got a sort of modernist diagram that says go from point A to point B, which is this paving, and then it's got odd patterns and bits of elements that negotiate between that uniform plane and the adjacent building context that sort of take up, once that's been flattened out and made to be a perfect surface, all of these edges negotiate their way in. And so in its language, it's sort of got this thing which is quite characteristically postmodern, where on the one hand it's got a balustrade that is a kind of classical balustrade, but then it has this element of the absurd and the overscaled thrown into the balustrade to indicate that this is a new thing, this is not an old thing, this is an interpretive measure on top of the old. Now, interestingly, this is built in the 1920s and 30s, but in actual fact, heritage practice based on something called the Borough Charter, the ICOMOS Borough Charter, would say that these days the additions and modifications to historic objects should demonstrate the contemporariness of the intervention. You shouldn't try to copy the old. You should have the new clearly, visibly different to the old so that people can pick up what is the difference. And so a lot of the time he would do that, even though he would reference what was there before. So these steps, for example, on the one hand, their materiality and the sort of treads and rises and stuff are kind of similar to the site, but the way they've dealt with has sort of gives them a twist all the way through. Similarly, in other parts of the site, he would do things, including introducing sort of really nice little moments of new motifs and pieces that are more Art Deco and Nouveau into that fabric. Particularly around drainage and those kind of services. And so all through the project, you can also see inclusion of other elements throughout. But it's a nice sort of balancing act between the existing and the proposed in this old castle. Now, the classic example that I always talked about as this Pallet Approach was this project, Uralbin Park in Sydney by Bruce Mackenzie. Bruce Mackenzie was one of Australia's sort of top landscape architects, or really one of the major landscape architects that developed the profession in Australia. And interestingly, and this is an argument I've made about landscape architecture in Australia, that he was first and foremost a contractor. And so a lot of the way that landscape architecture was born in Australia was people working as contractors, building gardens, no formal training. And indeed, you'll find that a lot of the greatest architects and landscape architects are people who never received training. I don't know what that says to us who did, but and so Mackenzie happened to be around at a moment that became known as the kind of the Bush School, and I mean you can hopefully see analogies dressed to South Africa here with the use of indigenous plants, and so in Sydney, I think I talked in the post-industrial lecture. I think I talked about how Sydney Harbour as a space was previously industrial around the edges, and so this site was originally a boat building yard on Sydney Harbour, and Mackenzie kept the dry dock but sort of partially filled it in and kept the shape of the water's edge and the heritage components, so they've been renewed recently. And he also as much as possible tried to keep existing stone, we call them floaters, on the landscape. And so they're these pieces of sandstone that float in the landscape, and a lot of the time they're a pain when you encounter them because once you hit one, they're too big to get rid of. And so a lot of this work was really about excavating till you find one of these floaters and then clearing it off and keeping and making it a feature. And then after that, they also found a lot of stone like this that was left on the site from when the dry dock had been made. And so on top of those floaters that he'd excavated, he made one of those floaters a ramp and built this sort of curved wall, this palisade fencing. And really the whole landscape language of the project was around sandstone, the sort of indigenous Sydney Harbour sandstone, native plants and grass. And so this became the kind of default language for landscape architecture in Australia from the 70s right through to when I was I was studying as a student. If you had a park, we used to call them picturesque parks, and they were like trees, grass, and that was it. And I think it's still, there's a lot of places where that still is the main way that parks have been dealt with, and that's because of maintenance largely, that it's ultimately the only thing you can afford to do is mow, and that's basically the only thing you can do. Now, interestingly, the landscape, this was seen as being really very much about the indigenous landscape of Sydney, but in actual fact, the plants that were being utilised, species of Lomandra, etc., casuarina and eucalyptus and these things called Gymea lilies, etc., in actual fact, they weren't indigenous. They were, a lot of the time, they were propagated by an industry which called them native. And so the plant materials themselves might have come from, 1,000 k's away. They might have been bred through particular things and bred up to have particular qualities. But at that stage, the idea of native versus indigenous was really, straightforwardly a thing. And now, for South Africa, this is a question that I think is interesting because to some extent, politically in South Africa, this idea about indigenous versus native is quite a problematic question, right? Because, we go through this idea of who belongs where is a major part of the discourse of South Africa, and so insofar as, for instance, my Afrikaans, in-laws would say, the indigenous people of the Western Cape are the Khoi people and therefore the coloured people, and this is a kind of an ethnic thing around appropriation of Khoi land by black people and all of this sort of discourse. And it's interesting if you talk about this in relationship to plants, because in a way it's a lot of the time we have this kind of thing between what is native, what is indigenous, and what is endemic. And so what happened here was that Mackenzie specified, in fact this plan was drawn by a landscape architect who would go on to be famous, a woman called Catherine Bull, who became one of Australia's sort of great educators. And so anyway, the species that are here are actually just these generic Australian native species. But they were planted with this idea that when we plant them, they will just regenerate. They're just going to come back. You're never going to have to plant anything again in this landscape. But in actual fact, none of these plants did regenerate. And so, in other words, by regenerate, I mean, sexual reproduction of the plant, creation of viable seed coming up on the site, and no need to replant. And this is important because a lot of the time the argument people make to use native plants is they belong on the site, they're best adapted to the site, they're going to be able to regenerate. But what we know is that regeneration is much, much more complex. So, for example, if you're talking about fynbos, you're talking about fire. Without fire, things are not going to regenerate. The same is true in Australia. And so this idea of specificity, that the site, this approach is about the site, and it's driven by the site, revealed to be what I call this palette-based thing, because ultimately it's not about the fact that the material itself is super specific to the site in the terms of it being endemic to the site. It's actually more generally native. And it's an important thing because it affects the long-term life of the project and the claims of the project to be specific. You realise it's actually a representation. It's a representation of Australianness that could be anywhere. In fact, it did happen anywhere. This type became all over Australia of these same 5 or 6 species, rock, trees, the same grass, and that became a kind of symbol for appropriate, native, etc. Now, I'll counterpoint those projects, which I'm calling palette projects, because the reference is via materials, but it's not always about site in a super specific way, to what I feel are the more important or the more interesting approaches, which are these ones that I call relationship-based approaches. So if we accept that site is an interpretation, always, which is that we're never truly site-specific because we always bring something to the table. We're always conditioning what's happening. You can never make the claim, this is the most specific project ever, because we always select some things and reject other things. We know this around discourses around intersectionality, that have come up around gender, sexuality, etc. We know that things like, increasingly we're realising that the binaries between, heterosexual and gay or lesbian is a binary, where in actual fact we know that there's actually a whole lot of a broader spectrum in there. And so we know that every time we create a category, we actually exclude some things that include others. And there was a book by a guy called Bryson called Looking at the Overlooked in Art. And it was really looking at this idea about what we select via our eye and what we leave behind. And so this project is an interesting, and so what I'm arguing really is that these projects, or these relationship projects, are not so much worried about authenticity, but they're more worried about trying to communicate things via the body. And so I think there's a thing that's called affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, and affect is really around the idea of a kind of a bodily experience, or you're being affected by something. And a lot of the time, affect it's a thing that's come through from Gilles Deleuze, etc. But it's a really important idea. And so I think landscape is inherently affective. So previously we would have said in the picturesque that our main sense is our eyes. We're going from one place to another. The body is like a machine that moves the eyes around the place. But it's a visual experience. It's a painterly experience. But an affective experience is an experience that happens on many physical levels. Could be smell at the same time as sight, at the same time as touch and hearing. And so it's a synesthetic, it's a crossing of boundaries between senses. And so this project by Michael van Kessel is a really interesting project. It's for a Merovingian ring fort. And so it's right on the edge of the valley that drops into the Rhine. And so, does anybody recognise the Merovingian name? Nobody here is a fan of The Matrix. No. Age difference, sorry. But there are these two characters in the third Matrix movie called the Merovingians. But anyway, basically the Dutch were the Merovingians. And also we talked previously about the way that they worked with the what's that? Do you know the guys I'm talking about? No. Who liked the third movie? The third movie was terrible, but, you're still if you're a fan, you're a fan. What do you say? You still watched it, right? So, But anyway, so the Netherlands doesn't really have any topography, but when it does, it's like super important. And so this is right next to a sort of hillside that falls off into the Rhine Valley below, the sort of wetlands below. It's on the border between Germany and the Netherlands. And so this fort is quite an old fort. It's probably from 300 or 400 AD or something like this. And obviously we know from our discussion about the Netherlands that the activity of poldering and reclamation means that people moved into the wetlands from Flanders and from France and from Germany. And so that sort of, in a way, this incursion into that land comes first from the sort of edges in Germany, etc. And so this is, if you can imagine, there's down here is the Rhine Valley that you can see in the bottom there. And at the top of that hill is this fort. And so effectively people were defending people coming from this direction because they never really need to defend people from this direction because it was too steep and they wouldn't get up there. So it's a creation of another wall. But rather than pulling out the wall, what's nice about this project is that it kind of communicates the shape of the topography even though you can't see it. And so, for example, in this up here, what you're seeing is that this is a kind of mound. So this is a 1,500-year-old piece of topographic shaping that would be visible because trees are growing all over it. There's regeneration. But by cutting into it and cutting away through it, they reveal the shape of the profile. And so the first relationship you get is that as you move through it and as you look at it, you see I'm moving through a piece of geometry. You don't see I'm climbing a hill because you can see that's the section on both sides. As you then move through into the centre, it then reveals a set of steps. And so that set of steps that you can't see when you're looking through then takes you to the top. And once you're at the top, you can then walk along the top of that shape. And so that's then putting you in the same situation as the people who would have defended the fort, which is that you're in this circulation system along the top of the fort. So on the one hand, you see the shape, and then you see the function by climbing it and going and walking along it. And ultimately, as you walk along it, what then happens is that you then get to a point where you start to move towards the end of it. You move towards this lookout here until you finally, at the lookout, you get a sense of that sort of view. And so in a way, the design doesn't do anything apart from circulates you to the existing features of the site, moves you of the existing shape of the site. And it's obviously got some, the way that those sort of acts are done are really nice as well, so that when you're, for example, moving along that strip there, along one at the top of that mound, there's also ways through that puts you from the top down. There's also some odd little gestures and bits of leftover fort on the site, etc. But on the whole, the site is left as it is, and the rest of it's just moving you through it. Now here we also see this kind of use of Core 10, which has become an icon for heritage activity in a way. And so I don't know how that happened, but ultimately the use of Core 10 in the period of the middle thousands became a default material to say, I am old. And I am old because I rust and because I register time.
I know people use it because no one wants to steal it.
In South Africa, no one wants to steal it because it's rusting. That's an interesting thing. Yeah, I mean, even though in actual fact, if you look at Core 10, the reason why it's a good material is that the best coating for rust is certain sorts of rust, right? That's how it works. And so the rusting actually protects the material. Have you had a lecture about this with Antonell yet? I think there's somebody talking about steel with you guys. Not yet. No. And so so that's, I think, do you get this point of what I'm talking about, this relationship thing? The materials are not all about the site. They're not saying, look, I'm sandstone, and sandstone's the material of the site, and if I just make stuff out of the material of the site, then I'm about the site. Instead, the relationship is your body in space, your body bringing the interpretation of what's happening. Another project that's a very different sort of project to this type of approach, but is similar in some respects, is this project, the Parc sans Vie by Georges Descamps. And Georges Descamps is a really interesting landscape architect. Again, I'm not sure that he was ever trained as a landscape architect, but he's interesting because he did a series of projects that were about site interpretation. Quite a lot of them were all going that sort of way. Was that you or was that me? So long as that's not my battery dying. Okay, your battery, that's okay. But what time is it, guys? That's all right. It's another finish early day today. But if we look at this project, what's interesting about it is that it's in a context that most people would never really care about. And so what it is like it's a housing estate on the edges of Geneva. Now, I mean, when you're talking about experience of landscape, this is an interesting thing, the case that I make in my book, is that there is a history in talking about landscape that is diaristic, which is how we keep a diary. In a way, our experience of the landscape can't be separated from our interpretation of the landscape. And this is the same as what Mosbach and Clarimont are saying, right? And so in a way, at the same time, any anecdotes we have about the site are also informative about how we understand the site. And this is my excuse for telling you this anecdote, which is that I was doing this trip around the whole of Switzerland in its car. I was in a conference in city Basel. And so I thought, Switzerland, it's a pretty small country. I've got 4 days. I should be able to drive around the entire length of Switzerland in 4 days in a car. So I hired a car, ripping through around Switzerland, which is basically like Switzerland I always think of as like a mountain that's got bits that are in all other countries with different languages. And the people who didn't like, have kind of moved up the hill, and then they've gone, well, you're French, you're Italian, you're German, but you're Swiss, even though actually they're parts of those other places. So I'm driving around Switzerland, and then I'm on my way round to this place in Geneva. And so I leave this part of this place called Locarno, where I'm looking at a project which is overlooking the lakes. This is when I had some money back in the day. And anyway, I get there and I go to drive and they say, oh, you have to get to the other side of the mountain, you have to drive your car onto a train to go through a tunnel to take you to the other side of the mountain. And I'm like, is it a problem? They say, no, but just remember that the last one goes at this time. And so, okay. And so I've got a hotel reservation in Geneva the next night, and I think I'm going to get through earlier, it's no problem. So I'm driving up this thing and it starts to snow. And so it's snowing and it's getting darker. And because the road's a switchback road, I haven't properly considered how long it's going to take. And then suddenly I get to this point where I can't see the road anymore. And I'm driving there and I'm like, I put my hazards on and I think, I don't know what I'm going to do here. And then this sort of like expensive car, whether it was an Audi, BMW, I don't know, zooms past me. And then I can see its tracks. And so what I do is I put my car in gear and I just get on the arse of that car and I follow its tracks all the way up the hill. And sure enough, it just keeps going. I'm following it for an hour, going way too fast, uncomfortably fast. And then it just drives straight into the train. And I drove straight into the train. The door closed behind me. And it's like I'm on a train in a car. It's only going through a mountain. It's like, tickets please, whatever. Get through the other side. Drive all the way through the valley, get to Geneva. And the reason I've gone to Geneva is that the day after that I'm about to fly out from Zurich. And Zurich is about 3.5, 4 hours from Geneva. Okay, my flight is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I've come all the way to look at this project because it's such a famous project in landscape history circles, landscape theory circles. So I'm at the hotel in Geneva, and there's no Google Maps, as we know it now, wasn't really present. What it was you could print out a description. And so I'm sitting in the car with a whole lot of pages of this thing on my lap. And I'm at this point where I've got the sheet open and it says, go straight ahead. And I get to this intersection and it's like I've got exactly half an hour to get to the site. So I can spend an hour on the site before I drive 3 hours to catch a plane. It's that kind of thing. And so I'm there and it says, go straight ahead. And it's like an intersection that goes 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was like, I have no idea where to go. And so I went one way. It was totally wrong. So I got to this site and I had 20 minutes on the site. And the whole site is about experience. And so you're supposed to be having this deep experience and understand the relationships. And instead, all you're trying to do is go, oh, that's right, I remember there's that part. I must photograph that part and I must photograph that part. Instead of having the experience, I'm trying to have the experience that other people have had in what they've written about it. And it really made me realize the role of mediation. Also, instead of it being a beautiful project, it's like in a tough housing estate. It's in a weedy, stinky creek. It's really small. But anyway, that's the kind of part of it. If we look at the diagram of it, it's sort of, there is this thing where here is the kind of creek. Here are these sort of big housing blocks. And it's sort of off the street, there's this sort of ramp that's over a few different levels. That's sort of like the negotiation between the sort of the municipal park and the creek. And so that's the sort of ramp. Where are we? Hang on. That's this sort of pergola ramp structure that goes down to this plinth that's next to the water. The bit that I hadn't expected to be was so nice was that there's this negotiation between the sort of perfect geometry of this circle and the sort of shape of the creek, because the shape of the creek has evolved through erosive processes that are like it's a dirty stormwater creek. It's like some bit of the Leespec that nobody's really thought about for a long time. And so when you get there, though, there's some really nice moments where, for example, you have the sort of counterpoint of the shape of the path on one side and the way that the path sort of projects into that creek space. At other points, the path, as it moves through the landscape, you can see there was once a tree here with a seat next to it that was cut down. You can see how the whole thing negotiates and works its way around the existing structures. So it's really sort of negotiating in a really specific way with the site's condition. Again, has to be developed on site. And then you have this thing where you link the other part of the site. You have, I always think underpasses are the worst things in the entire world. And as one of my old bosses used to say, nothing good comes from going underneath something else. And so, which is his way of saying go over always. And so this thing is kind of interesting because it's sort of like if we think about the influence of land art, It's really like this crossing is continued out as a bridge into the landscape off that other path I showed you, and it moves into this tunnel, and then halfway along there's this sort of view before. And so on the one hand you say it's a kind of nasty looking kind of space, but it's an attempt to try to make as much as possible out of something that is as sinister as possible. And sort of it reminds me now, I think about it, like I would not walk into this thing for a second, but it's playing upon the idea of the grotto, right? It's treating this underpass like it's a grotto. Now I've talked about this one before, but I'll just the other week, but it's my final example before we talk about some projects from South Africa. But if we think about these, the other approach that I'm talking about is, as much as it might be about trying to celebrate, for instance, if we go to this one, it's trying to celebrate the Indigenous. At the same context in Sydney Harbour, these ones are really about trying to celebrate the undesigned. And so if you think about sight as something you find, something you try to find and approach, you know, inherently we'll try to approach sight as viscerally, as without as little baggage as possible. Then whether something is Indigenous or not doesn't matter. Whether it's designed or not doesn't matter. It has qualities. And so a lot of the time landscape is about tracking qualities, articulating the qualities of something else, bringing an emphasis onto the qualities that are already there. The interpretation is the tool that you use to draw attention to those. On the one hand, I've said, you know, one thing is to draw attention to the qualities by treating them as a material. The other one is to try to treat them as a series of affective relationships. In this project by JMD, you know, it's really about saying that even, and I always go to this one here as an example because, you know, this is like an existing old seat with an existing piece of concrete here, hasn't been replaced, has been left cracked, and then it's been negotiated with via these other mechanisms. It's in a way trying to utilise this tool to bring attention, and colour here, to bring attention to the fact that the site has evolved its own stuff over time. Things have emerged from the site by dealing with ad hoc functional problems. Perhaps this site, you know, perhaps somebody, one of the supervisors up here was a smoker, and perhaps they like to have a cigarette with a view, and so perhaps a seat was moved there. And so all of these little decisions accumulate in the landscape, and they're kind of little make goods, they're little fixes. And I really think a lot of the time we can learn a lot from those little fixes, because a lot of those little fixes show us, you know, it's like when you go to a site and you see drainage fixes would be a classic. When you see how people have tried to deal with drainage, that's the first thing that would tell you that you're going to have to find a way of dealing with water on a site. And so in a way, rather than treat that as rubbish to be cleared out, this project just tried to use insertions to link them together. So it's effective because it's moving you across one surface, an existing surface, linking you onto another. There's another one where previously you would have never got that view of this building because of the fact that you'd never access it from this side. By putting you onto this floater then, you're then able to see this other side of the site. And all through are these little things that, you know, there's Anton's drawings, which is these little, as he would have called them, these little band-aids or sticky plasters that link the whole design together, you know. And so, and honestly, and some of them are kind of interesting, like I find this one interesting because it's, again, this regularization thing. We have these three steps that have a roughly regular, these two steps have a roughly regular rise, and he's just kept that depth and just fixed it up and moved it up in its way through. Obviously, it's an economical approach as well. And so these are a kind of like those, just to sort of talk about those two approaches again. I think it's clear. One is about affect, about moving the body in space and focusing on the relations that you get as you move through space. The other one's saying, I'm referencing sight by how I utilize material. Now, I don't think actually the division is as straightforward as I'm making it out. I think that both of them are a bit flexible. So let's just quickly now, as we finish up a bit, we're not actually finished up, but you know, as we get closer to the finishing up bit, let's now talk a little bit about South Africa. Because last weekend I went to Josie and I went through some places that I've been hearing about, and I'm kind of interested to know how we position how we position these things. And so the first one, I suppose everyone knows this one. What's this one? Oh, interesting. Like that's, when I see that, it's like, whoa, what happened to the public landscape? Is there any future for landscape architecture and urban design in South Africa? You know, like, it's fine. Like, it's great that somebody's getting some shelter there, but, you know, when you know that this was an urban renewal project 10 years ago, you go, oof, something didn't work. So Constitution Hill, right? So this is Constitution Hill in Johannesburg. And so, you know, it's going through, so this is the sculpture that, this is originally a jail that then became a fort that Paul Kruger built to try to defend, I don't know enough of my South African history, but defend whatever it was that Paul Kruger was defending. And so, so if we look at how it works, you know, obviously this is I'm not quite sure what this Coca-Cola SAB Miller thing is. It about water? I'm not really sure. I mean, apartheid. Pushed our kids to smoke. Interesting. So when you go in there are these sort of, you know, on the one hand, it's kept the sort of the fort outline, and it's also, it's sort of, you know, as you move up onto the top, you get these views over the city. And obviously one of the most symbolic things that the site is doing is that it's by putting a kind of constitutional, celebrating the Constitution on a prison, it's trying to return a negative thing into a positive thing. But if we look at this approach, where would you situate that approach in the projects that we've been looking at? You know, these are relics, etc. Where would you, how would you, does it fit? Does it redefine the type? You know, it's clearly, is anybody going to say anything? Am I going to have to just talk? I'm talking, I know, that's the way it goes. Okay. I mean, I would have said that it's this relationship approach then, again, because it's putting you in relationship to the existing site's geometry. It's moving you around the site. It's obviously got a heritage thing about maintaining things, but it's also doing things like, for example, I mean, it was Human Rights Day when I was there. It's also doing things like adapting existing site geometry like guardhouses, etc., and then making them into larger things. I don't know why I took this photo of this Nando's thing, but anyway. And so it's similar to the projects that are by JMD in terms of the Cockatoo Island thing. So it's reappropriating the existing and reusing it, but it's also then retasking it with a different function, and it's also moving us through it. Now, where am I now? Does anyone have any idea where I am now? Sharpeville. So here I'm in Soweto here, and so these are as we're going towards Walter Sisulu Square. And so interestingly, does anybody know what these have a relationship to? Any architectural history? No. Louis Barragan did it in Mexico, did a whole intersection that has these coloured things, which is quite beautiful. And so this project was really interesting to me. Do you know the project I'm talking about? It's Walter Sisulu Square. It's got these enormous, I mean, let's ignore those guys, but it's that view, I don't know if you'd recognise it. It's got these huge buildings on either side, and it's got, this is the Freedom Charter memorial here in Walter Sisulu Square. And I mean, it's an interesting project because, I mean, the first thing you can note is that this is Saturday morning, and it's on the one hand, it's got a lot of people in it, and on the other hand, it's got virtually no people in it. So it's the scale of it. And so I think it's interesting that, like, we were there, and a young guy came up to me, you know, hi, welcome to Soweto, having a nice chat to him. He's a UCT student. He's doing his master's here. And so he's talking to me about the place, what he's up to. And what's really interesting to me was, on the one hand, he thought that this was he quite liked the grandioseness of the space, but we talked a lot about people scale. And so, you know, this is actually, there's like hundreds of people in this space right now. But, you know, it looks like there's so few people there. And it's because the scale of it And he was saying, we need to paint this thing white. He said, it's so grey and heavy and in a way it's interesting because it's sort of not too dissimilar to a kind of fascist architecture of the apartheid era redeployed for this new function. So on one hand you could say as an urban design gesture, it's sort of aligned in this line between Soweto and the city, so it's got a relationship to the suburb. I mean, it has some amazing qualities to it. I thought it was quite beautiful, but in a sense, its memorialness was on the one hand, it had this as a memorial, but in a way it's another thing because it's almost like urban design as a memorializing gesture, and architecture as a memorializing gesture. As you move through it, I mean, this is have people seen this one? Have you seen pictures of this one already? You guys, the architects must have, right? Yeah, no. I don't know who designed it. Can someone look up who designed this for me on their phone?
It could have been Studio Mass.
No, it's older than that. It's called Walter Sisulu Square. And I mean, yeah, it's interesting because as a designer, I was like, in a way, these like the kind of the proportionality of those spaces. On the one hand, you could say, why shouldn't we redeploy the monumentality of architecture in service of a range of different values? And I can see that, like, this is where Kevin's angle with this one would be. His angle is always the best we can do is the best we can do, which is like we do the best architecture we can do for the diversity of clients we have. That's doing the job properly. We don't patronise, we don't try to talk down, we don't try to interpret, we just provide good architecture to our clients, which is actually a view I'm quite sympathetic to. And because if you don't approach it this way, you're treating it as an anthropological problem. The scale is wrong. Normal people don't like this scale, and you're starting to make assumptions about users again, right? And so you're in this weird space where, what am I doing here? Am I, and on the other hand, it's like you could say that at the bottom of it, it's actually, this is the and there's the Soweto Hotel. So in an urban design sense, it's doing quite a number of interesting things, I think. It's like it's bringing functions into a place that would not normally have that function. It's working on the fact that Soweto is developing its own tourist culture, that people want to stay in Soweto. It's bringing the kind of heights of particular sort of architecture to bear, etc. But at the same time, it's something about its scale is weird. When you go into it, inside this thing, I'll get in there eventually. It's got a whole lot of it's got the Freedom Charter written around the centre of it, and then it's got relations between this through this one to the other one. So it's got it's a well designed piece. It's quite a lyrical sort of Tato Ando-ish sort of interior space to it. The thing is, it's almost got too much space that'll never have enough program for it. So it's never actually going to get enough in there, even though, and the kind of program that is available is not the kind of program that people around the site are currently utilising. And so when you get into the spaces underneath these, you realise that even, that considering the scale of them, there is actually, I would have thought, much greater potential for informal trade to be occurring, etc., etc. And it's sort of highly underutilised, whereas the outside of that space, which is like spaza shops, is going ballistic. And so you go, what is happening here? That space behind there is absolutely packed with people. So, did we find out who it was?
Studio Mass.
It is Studio Mass.
There was a couple of different firms, but the architect was Studio Mass.
Okay. Do we like?
It's a big project.
It's a big project, right? I mean, I like Studio Mass's work, and this is where I think that one of the things we have to think about design a lot of the time is that it's about testing, right? And so this is where it's interesting to me that it's still, like, you can't put your finger on a particular solution that you can always regard as being the right solution in these terms. And I think the one thing that's useful about landscape thinking is that it will try to think about working from site specificity back. Incredibly particular readings. Like if we look at some of the stuff that's failing at the moment in Kailicha that's been done by VPUU recently, it's not bad work or anything like that. But in actual fact, it's the stuff that the DAG guys talked about last year. I don't know if you remember this bus terminal they made there. And it's a bus terminal. It's quite beautiful, but it's just in the wrong spot. So no amount of building it beautifully and organising it well is going to move people's logic that's already happening to be the right place. But Tana, I went there the other day, and she's like, well, now this link is getting stronger, and so maybe this will work. And so how we balance top down, bottom up, this approach is much more tactical. The approach that I'm talking about for the sort of site-based approach is much more tactical. It's working from site fabric. But at the same time, if you're talking about a city, you have to be strategic as well. Now, next one. Okay, and where's this project? Let me find. I mean, it's hard to take photos because I'm trying not. Yes, that's right. So there's a Hector Pieterson Memorial just on the top of what's the name of that street? The major street in Soweto that people are the tourist street. What's it called? Vilakazi, yeah. And so this project, who is done by? Can you look this one up for us as well? This is the Hector Pieterson Memorial. Mashavane Rose, yeah. And so this project is an interesting one because it demonstrates a few things to you about a memorialisation, because in a way it's like hedging its bets, this project. It's got every possible type of memorialisation in the one project. And so it's got some really lovely aspects in terms of landscape about it. Obviously they have water, so that's really nice for them. But and so it's got this kind of water feature that's moving from the top up here, which is where the kind of clear memorial aspect is. And for those of you who've never been here, I really recommend it also to go to the museum. So it's talking about the shootings of the students in 1976, and it's talking about one particular student, which is Hector Pieterson, who was famously the student on the newspapers at the time that catalysed a lot of the international sentiment about apartheid. And so from being in Australia, it's the first image I remember seeing was this image. And so when you go through it, obviously it's got, in a way we can say this is a kind of a standard sort of memorialisation act, which is around the plaque attached to something. And so that's the most, in a way what we're talking about is levels of didacticness. Because didacticness is that we're teaching something, we're telling a story. And it's quite interesting, the ecological people who work on projects in Australia, they call it interp, interpretation. And so the people who do this, they'll say, oh yeah, we need to get someone to do interp for this project, which is like signage that says, this is, on this site 250 million years ago, there was a volcanic thing. So they call it interp. And you're like, yeah, we can put a bit of interp there, a bit more interp over there. And previously I would have said that's a really bad idea. But I've actually got a bit older now, and I think interp is not a bad thing. Interp is difficult when it's things that are around opinion, interp is difficult. But when it's things around landscape quality, sometimes interpretation, people like to read, right? So readability is not something to be afraid of. It's definitely something that can be done badly. And so, here is and what's so interesting, I think, is that this is like a prefabricated drainage module, right? It's a culvert. And so I think this is interesting because it's also utilising sort of industrial materials or everyday materials. Building is beautiful building, and so here is the kind of the sort of central moment of the memorial. And so this project is really straddling a number of different types, because it's giving you the interpretation. It's giving you, this is the famous image that was published. And this guy, I was reading the story of the guy who was holding Hector Pieterson, and he disappeared immediately after this into Botswana and then into Nigeria, and they never saw him again. So he's actually he's a really important part of this history that nobody knows what really happened to him. His family never heard from him again. And so in a way, it's like there are a lot of stories in this site, and so what's interesting is that this memorialisation thing is trying to crystallise the sort of moment that this happened, and the significance of this person to that history. But ultimately, you'd have to say that, and you can see how involved it is in the sort of tourism of the place. And memorials are those things like museums, like botanic gardens, that we regularly visit because we use memorials and monuments to tell us the stories of the places we visit. So they're tied into public meaning. But ultimately, it's the building itself it's the building itself that tells the story the best in terms of it's the interpretation in the building. You go in the building and you get the story. And so you have to think, what is the landscape really, what is it doing? What's the role of it in this sense, in this situation? A relationship approach would say that we're trying to get an affective sense of something. I don't know if you guys know the Berlin Memorial we talked about it, didn't we? The one by Eisenman, right? And so in a way, that's a clear example of an affective thing. There's a grid of people who died in the Holocaust. You walk between the concrete columns. You get immersed in that experience. It gives you an affective sense in the experience, and from the outside, it gives you a diagram. So it's a representation and an experience. Whereas here, I think ultimately it's really, for instance, this point here, it says, the line in the ground. I'll just see if I can zoom it up a little bit. The line in the ground joins the entrance of the museum to the point where the clash with police occurred and where Hector Pieterson died. And so it's interesting that really in terms of site specificity, that line, everything else is symbolic. That line is specific in a way to a geographic. If we think back to the lecture about, if we think back to these guys and their use of an axis, for example, and their use of geometry as a referent there, and we compare that to this, it's interesting because we start to think, what does that line mean? Is there any relevance to what that line can give us? How are we going to remember these things? How are we going to tell these stories in these things? I mean, I do think it's an interesting thing, but it is telling that they needed to do that. Ultimately, from the interior of the buildings also, here is talking about the cooling towers. So this is where it's there's another one where they talk about the view from the police station, from this site. So it's a weird thing to me that the landscape is less specific than the calibration of the building through the windows to the context. And so while sight is about sight is also about positioning the viewer. And architecture, if nothing else, architecture is very good at positioning the viewer. You think about the role of the ramp in contemporary architecture, it was so much about moving people around, giving people particular views. And architecture is actually very good at that. Landscape's much more ambiguous, but at the same time, landscape's more specific. It's site-specific, it's grounded. So you have that thing, if it's about interpretation, one is better at interpretation, but it's more abstract. The other one is less abstract, but interpretation is vaguer. It's a kind of an interesting analogy. And so here we have this point where, this is really where for me, this is the least successful part of it. Each one of these bricks is like a brick that has that is like for each of the children that died. And I think I think that needs to be recorded somewhere. But for me, this context is something, I don't know. I think the idea of trying to set up putting the names and the people in something like a educational context, whether it be like a schoolroom or something that relates the experience of the fact that the program was around these children's not being refused to be educated in Afrikaans because Afrikaans was the language associated with apartheid. So how do you broach that thing between education as a program and the memorialisation? And this is the space that does it, and I don't think it does it very well. But overall, if I compared the three projects in a kind of overtly design sense, the project that most interested me was the Walter Sisulu Square, because it had a whole lot of qualities that I might have found to be interesting, and it was quite provocative. But the one that moved me most was definitely Hector Pieterson. Hector Pieterson, in the sense that it was telling it, it did it really well. But in the sense of landscape, it was kind of ineffective for me, even though it tried to deploy every single type of memorializing thing at the one time. Okay, we might leave it as that.